Welcome to the Data-Driven CFO, refocusing on the KPIs that matter. Brought to you by the Controllers Council. My name is Neil Brown, Executive Director of the Controllers Council. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. After our experts' presentation, we'll have audience Q&A. So attendees, please submit your questions via the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to as many as possible in the hour. Answer to a frequent question. You'll receive a link to this webcast via email in the next 24 hours, so no need for notes or screenshots. And one other point, our expert speaker, Scott, mentioned that a PDF of these slides are available with key metrics identified and definitions and how to calculate. We'll have that in the post webcast email. We'll have Scott's email address, but that's all you have to do is send him an email and request that. So with that, I'd like to introduce our sponsor, Oracle NetSuite, a cloud-based business management platform used by more than 28,000 organizations across the globe. NetSuite seamlessly integrates financial planning, AR, AP, RevRec, tax management, and other core accounting functions with real-time financial visibility to improve financial performance. Learn more at netsuite.com and request a free product tour. So with that, I'd like to introduce our expert speaker, D. Scott Beaver, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Oracle NetSuite. Scott has nearly 20 years of marketing experience, so he's a career marketer like myself. And he's had experience in a number of different types of organizations, from startups to large enterprises. Scott, welcome.
Thanks, Dylan. Appreciate it.
It's all
right, so why don't we jump into this? For any of you, yes, we are a software company, but I want to make sure everyone understands this is really not a sales pitch. This is really, I want to focus on how we go about developing an effective set of metrics for a business. And while I'll try to cover as many as I can, there are certainly going to be metrics that you may be using in your organization that I don't touch on. But the thing I want to start with is just highlighting that the metrics that you choose really are very much dependent on your business model. A services company is going to have different requirements or KPIs they want to track than a company that sells wholesale goods, and that's going to be different than a company that sells subscription software, for instance. So they're going to be it's really very dependent on your business model and certainly on your industry. We use the word metric and KPI interchangeably quite often, but I will say a KPI, technically speaking, is when you have a specific target, a specific objective that you're measuring toward and trying to make sure you hit that. And so the metrics you establish, the KPIs you establish, are also going to be very much dependent upon the specific business objectives or the drivers of your organization. And some companies have very unique metrics that they want to track that are very specific to just their business, or and then others may want to track things that are pretty standard. So the last two things that are essential before you set out on defining your metrics, and it's number 3 here, you've got to have the data. I know that's a no-brainer, but if you don't have a system in place or a mechanism for gathering the data that you need on a consistent and regular basis, and that you're certain that it's accurate, then it's not going to do you a lot of good to say, hey, I want to have these KPIs. And that tends to be the biggest challenge for a lot of organizations. It's just gathering that data and gathering it consistently. Having a KPI that you track once a year, really not as valuable as one that you can evaluate quarterly, or better yet, monthly. And in some organizations, for some particular metrics, they may even do weekly or even daily tracking of certain KPIs. Again, it's very industry, business model, and objective dependent. And then the last thing here is time and resource. We all know how busy everyone is these days. We never seem to have enough time to accomplish everything. And one thing about best practices, and I will be talking a little bit about that, one of the things about best practices is they're great if you have the time to implement them. And so that's certainly a consideration when you set out to try to define a better set of metrics for your organization. As a controller, CFO, whatever your role is, you got to find the time and the resources in the organization to get that data and communicate and share those metrics with others. And that's really going to be the biggest limiter: the data availability, the time, energy, and resource to do it properly is probably the hardest part. But moving on from that to our next slide, let's talk about how we're going to go about defining metrics for our organization. There's a great website if you want to learn more about sort of the topic of metrics. It's kpi.org, and it's an online resource that's provided by the Balanced Scorecard Institute. If you're not familiar with the concept of the Balanced Scorecard, it was initially a book written by a couple of Harvard professors. But just do a quick search. It's a great way to think of bottom-up metrics. I like to call it bottom-up metrics that help you manage your business from the standpoint of what does the individual person need to do to achieve their metrics, and how do those drive all the way up to the overall organizational goals. So I highly recommend that website and the concept in general of the Balanced Scorecard. But they have, KPI.org sort of defines 6 steps, and I really like the way they frame it or outline it. So that's what how I'm going to talk about this first. And so when you begin to define the metrics for your business, the very first thing you need to do is start with the end in mind. Another favorite book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Begin with the end in mind. So what is my intended result? If I'm going to measure something, why am I measuring it, and how is it going to contribute to the success of my business, my department, what have you, or even my own job? So start there with my intended result and a target number, ideally. Then number 2 is understand that there are other measures that I might want to use. So once you've sort of defined the results you want, you should be able to come up with a list of a lot of potential other measures that you could use to track performance against each one of the results you've identified. And there may be 30 or 40 different results you're trying to achieve, depending on the size of your organization, what you do, the departments, et cetera. But understand that whatever result you want, there are often a variety of different ways to measure how you're performing against that result, and look for as many ways as you can, because sometimes when we may not have the data we want for one way to measure a result, but we had data that's available to measure it in a different way. So, or measure an outcome in a different way. So make sure you think about all the different varieties or variations of metrics that you could use to monitor your performance toward whatever set of results you're trying to track. And again, if you're interested in learning more about potential metrics, I highly suggest you pick up a copy of the Balanced Scorecard. And I also recommend the American Productivity and Quality Center, apqc.org. I highly recommend that site. They do, it's basically a site where they benchmark various performance metrics. A lot of them are around accounting and procurement. There are others as well, but where they benchmark various by industry, by company size. And so it's a great resource for trying to evaluate yourself, how you compare with others in your industry or companies of your size. So definitely suggest you check them out. Again, it's apqc.org. And I'll talk about them again in a bit. So once after you understand those alternative measures, then you need to select the right measurements for each objective. So you've got this long list of things you could use to measure your performance against results, but what are the right ones? As Edward Deming said, what gets measured gets managed. Sometimes that's misquoted, but it's what gets measured gets managed. And so it's now time to really narrow down all those potential measures that you've identified in the previous steps and select just those that are, that you feel like are best reveal how strategic performance is improving, whether it's worsening or staying the same. So you quickly have to think of it as you start with a large funnel at the top, and you have a lot of ideas going in, but you very quickly have to start narrowing it down to just those you can track, again, consistently, that you have the data for and that are meaningful. I've done balanced scorecard engagements with other organizations in the past, and it's very easy to come up with 100 metrics. But when you try to start scaling it down, that's sometimes where the challenge is, because everybody has their favorite metrics. But about 12 to 20 is what I see in most organizations as sort of the max that they can really make sense of. Just a thought there. So once you've done those first 3 steps, the next step is to define the composite indices as needed. And what I mean by that is you may have several KPIs that relate to a specific outcome. There are a lot of different ways of looking at profitability, for instance. You may, obviously there's gross net margin, but you may want to look at product lines or categories. Just as an example, you may want to also look at profit by employee, profit by division, those sorts of things. So there are a lot of different ways you can do it. So, in the case that you have several KPIs that sort of relate to the same outcome, you may want to group them together for tracking purposes. And a good way to do that is using many the available dashboarding tools. I highly recommend dashboards. You'll see an example of one later that part of the NetSuite system, but there are many different tools out there to help you build dashboards with these metrics, and they really should be based on for the most effect based on the role. So if you can get a role-based dashboard that managers in different departments can use for the metrics that relate to them and their staff, that's going to be more effective than just having one for the entire company usually. So dashboarding tools, as I said, are very important, and there's a lot of solutions out there that are very flexible. So just as you think through your program and are defining these metrics, that's how you present them, how you consistently present that information is going to be critical. And then the 4th step should be pretty obvious, but it's one that sometimes we forget about, and that's you need to set very specific targets and thresholds for performance. I know what my intended results are. I've come up with all different sorts of ways of measuring those results, measuring my performance against those outcomes. Now I've got to make sure I set targets. So it's not enough just to measure. You've got to actually say, here's what I'm going for. Here's the thresholds. Here's the minimum performance I'm willing to accept. Here's my ideal target, et cetera. So make sure you set those targets and thresholds. And then finally, you need to define, document, and communicate what those selected performance measures are. That's sort of the last step in this process before I begin. Now I'm going to go out and track all these metrics. Usually what's worked for me is bringing together a group of key business leaders in an organization from different departments. We define and agree on what the metrics we are going to use are. Then once we've got that agreement, we communicate it out to a broader audience. This could be, depending on the size of your organization, it may be a lunch and learn with individual line managers or frontline staff. It may be, a series of all hands meetings, but it's very important if you're going to use these metrics to track the performance of your business and you want buy-in across the organization, you want your people to feel like they're engaged and part of this process of helping the company perform better, making sure they understand what the metrics are, why you've chosen them, how those measures are calculated, and how they relate to the broader goals of the business is very important. That's where I've seen a lot of KPI initiatives fail because a bunch of executives got together and decided what was important, and they understand why it's important, but they didn't communicate it effectively to the rest of the organization, and so the frontline staff don't change their behavior or don't see any reason to achieve a certain measure because it's not been explained to them. So that's a key step.